Hi, welcome to the What Drives You podcast. My name is Keith, and today we're going to be talking about the Port of Baltimore, Scope 3 emissions, and union negotiations. Kate and Christina, thanks so much for joining me today. Let's get the conversation going. So, First question, Christina. How can supply chains adapt and build resilience to mitigate the disruption caused by unexpected events?
I think so. The first thing is diversification. Realistically, if you are a shipper and you are only moving by one mode, you're putting yourself at risk.
Right.
I think we look at the Port of Baltimore and what took place there. A number of our customers who actually ship into the Port of Baltimore, not necessarily knowing that this was going to happen, because nobody really did, but they had already moved to diversify coming inland to these states by diversifying their different ports that they were utilizing and coming into. So they also move their volume once it gets inland via intermodal and your traditional truck. So they have actually weathered this storm extremely well. Even though the Port of Baltimore was one of their primary ports, they were actually able to move a lot of their freight to their secondary port,
right.
And really didn't lose any traction. So absolutely diversification is going to be your biggest ability to correct this. Yeah.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. Kate, you and I talked about that a little bit before as well.
Yeah, I can't really add too much onto
Right.
that. I think it really comes down to finding a carrier or a logistics provider that's going to be able to evaluate all of those particular solutions along your supply chain, and being able to evaluate what's going to be right on price, what's going to be right on, the time delivery based off of whatever your needs are.
Right.
And when you have a carrier that's able to do that.
Yeah, well, and then on top of that too, not even being afraid to go ahead and use maybe a little bit non-traditional modes. So do you LTL certain commodities, or do you go with a brokerage opportunity if you haven't done that in the past? And choosing a carrier that has those multiple modes and those different levers is always going to be in your best interest.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I think, it's interesting to see how the industry kind of diverted and kind of, I don't want to say made it a non-event, but it was impressive, and I guess the question I have in this instance, if it would have been a high market, meaning we're struggling to garner capacity, find capacity.
Yeah.
Wonder if it would have been as successful of a diversion.
I think so. I think it would have still been all right. I mean, the way that the country as a whole reacted to it really quickly, I think that helps too. And just because it's a singular event that took place that was very specific. Now, a natural disaster, a little bit different, because you're going to have a much broader scope of the effect of it. Port of Baltimore is realistically, I think it's 17th when it comes to total inbound tonnage, but it is 10th when it comes to the dry bulk moves, so your grains and anything that comes from overseas. So a lot of that got actually diverted back to Louisiana, which is the number one port for bulk grains. And that's just because they're set up really well to be able to offload those bulk shipments and get those out to market faster.
Awesome.
There was a heavier impact for your motor vehicles,
right? Because
Baltimore is actually a big player when it comes to import and export of motor vehicles. But in fact, one of the steamship lines that's coming in has all of those motor vehicles coming in. So there's 3 channels that are currently open. The 4th one may be opening today, tomorrow, to allow those steamships that have been in there since the bridge went down to get out and come back in. Once that's open, it's going to be open for a total of just 4 days, so that steamship lines can pass in that have been waiting out in port for the entirety of this time. And then what that will allow them to do is get the people that have literally been stuck on these ships now for a long time.
That's crazy.
Out and home. But on the reverse of that, then they will be shutting it down for another 10 days. And what they anticipate then is that's going to allow them to get a much bigger portion of the entire port open back up. They really do think that they're going to still be able to hit that end of May opening of the port.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's impressive. I guess, honestly, that really kind of dove into my follow-up question. So I'm going to use this as a great time to transition to our next topic. So fantastic stuff there. let's jump into Scope 3 emissions. This is something we've talked a bit about, alternative fuel options, but we really haven't dove into Scope 3 before on our podcast. So I'm excited about this one. But as a precursor to that, Kate, as a precursor to Scope 3, what's the latest on alternative fuels and transportation? What are you hearing right now?
Oh gosh, there's tons of things that are happening.
Right.
Just this morning, we have 2 new headlines. Tesla stepping up, ramping up production of Class 8 vehicles. Electric vehicles,
okay.
yeah. And then this is really exciting because this is something that we've been monitoring as far as how hydrogen is really going to become a player in the alternate fuel space.
Right.
And they just opened up their first public commercial vehicle hydrogen place over in California. It's in California right now, but it's something that's like we're really excited to see these things come online.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is it's advancing. The technology is coming in. All that is still at a pretty slow pace.
Right.
And I think that's where it comes down to just understanding what is this learning curve really going to be.
Right.
So carriers and shippers, they're kind of combining to test where the alternate fuels are going to be in the right space. Because not every load that's going to be a heavier load is going to be able to take battery electric.
Right.
Or it might not be able to go a particular distance at this time.
Right.
It might get there when we get to 2050, when we retired and all that. But right now, where we need to make the most impact is where everybody's kind of hemming and hawing on it.
Right.
And that's where I think that when it comes to the fuels that are available right now, you're really looking at those natural gas. And when we think about natural gas, everybody's kind of like, ooh, methane. Methane comes from a ton of sources.
Right.
So you might have driven by a landfill and you see the flare off. Or, we think about those manure pit lagoons when it comes to cattle in the beef and dairy industry, and that releases methane. Well, if we can capture that, it becomes renewable natural gas.
Right.
And that's where we're really excited in this space for paper transport in particular.
Right.
And then there's also renewable biodiesel, which is also really exciting. And it comes from pretty much the same components, but it's just captured slightly differently.
Right.
And as far as what the technology is then adapted into the trucks. And what's great about those 2 sources right now is the infrastructure is already there.
Right.
We've got the diesel gas stations.
Yep.
We've got natural gas stations. I mean,
Right.
it's so prevalent right now, so it makes it really attractive. Mm-hmm. So we're hoping that the infrastructure is going to be coming online soon, but it's just not at the pace where we need it to be.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. Definitely. So as you think about that, kind of correlate that, Kate, back into the offsets or the emissions that come from these sources, these
sure,
different things. So think about Scope 1 and 2, and that's what everybody's talking about, right?
Yep.
But what about Scope 3? What about Scope 3?
So everybody's talking about Scope 1, 2, and 3 because the SEC just passed that ruling that if you're a publicly traded company, that you have to report your greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
And so they broke it down Scope 1, 2, and 3. Mm-hmm. And Scope 1, that's pretty much like, let's say you have private vehicles at your company, right? So if you go to a meeting out of state and you take the private vehicle, that's part of your Scope 1.
Okay.
Or maybe it's like the actual facilities, the building, the footprint. Scope 2 is the electricity that we're using to light the building.
Right.
It's the heating and the cooling.
Right.
So those are the 2 ones. And it's very much more within your control. So everybody was like, okay, cool, we can kind of handle that. And Scope 3, oh my God. Scope 3 is everything else.
Right.
So it's transportation and distribution. It's how you're sourcing the products. It's everything along your value chain. And so it's like, how do you then track all that information down?
Right.
And that's where everybody kind of, Scope 3 got scared. So SEC is not requiring Scope 3. But then you have countries like some of the customers, well, several of the customers that we service, who are European based, that are headquartered there.
Right.
So they have to comply with those particular laws. Right. So where we see the most growth right now in the RNG or alternative fuel space is with those European based companies.
Right.
And it's only going to be a matter of time before it's going to be more in demand here.
Right.
And the thing of it is, when it comes to Scope 3, it makes up, I believe, what is the metric? 92% of an organization's greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. So it's a big deal, right? In comparison to scope 1 and 2, right? More controllable, but the impact, what you're saying, is in scope 3.
It's in scope 3.
Right. Okay.
And in particular, if you look at your upstream and your downstream activities,
Right.
transportation and distribution is in both.
Okay.
So if you're thinking about, okay, I have to pick up this raw material so I can make my awesome product, well, a truck or a train is bringing it to your facility.
Right.
You do your scope 1, scope 2,
Right.
and then you got to get it back out to the consumer or to the warehouse or wherever you're bringing it.
Right.
And that's where you can make a significant impact, is if you are a little bit like, oh God, I don't know if I can do the whole thing. Well, the SEC is buying you time right now. Start with transportation and distribution,
Right.
and then work your way down the value chain.
Right. Awesome. Great. So kind of working through that process and getting into this, how can companies overcome challenges related to data collection, verification, and quantifying scope 3 emissions?
Sure. So carriers like us,
Yep.
we have the ability to calculate those emissions right at the get.
Okay.
So it's becoming more common practice for us that, as we're including in a bid for truckload, to also provide, hey, this is what your diesel emissions will look like.
Right.
And then compare it over to RNG.
Right.
And see what the price differential would be.
Right.
And so I think it really just comes down to educating at the front, and carriers have the ability to do that. There's a number of resources from Environmental Defense Fund with the Green Freight Handbook.
Yep.
That they give you the calculations right there, and all you need to do is boop, 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 and you can get your numbers. Otherwise, the rail offers calculators galore on how much you're going to save on your greenhouse gas emissions. It's something like for every 200 trucks is one train.
One train, yep.
That blows your mind as far as how much emissions that you're just pulling out from there, and then you combine it with a solution like RNG.
Yeah, you double down. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it really increases your efficiency. And then of course there's a growing industry that are providers that they're happy to collate this data for you.
Plenty of experts out there.
Yeah. So
Willing to help.
you will just go looking and you'll find them. Yep.
All right. So we've talked about scope 3 and what it is, how big it is, how important it is. A question here that I think really would sit with a shipper: do consumers really care about emissions and sustainability?
Yeah,
I believe so too.
Oh yeah.
I think it's to varying degrees.
Yeah.
But I mean, especially if you are a product that is marketing itself as environmentally friendly, or you are a company that is out there specifically marketing yourself as eco-friendly, your consumers care.
All right.
They care, and they're more likely to return and buy again.
Yeah.
So there was a McKinsey and Company survey that they did last year, and they found that 60% of all consumers, they will make a buying decision because of the sustainability effort. And then it's 34 to 40% are repeat buyers then.
Yep.
That's a significant difference.
So they do care.
Yeah, and you probably have even heard in advertising, I've heard about like the death of the BLT sandwich on the radio kind of thing, and it's about taking sustainable efforts as part of their supply chain to produce mail. Like that's a big deal.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that's fantastic. I mean, it's good to hear. I mean, because it does matter. Then it matters to the communities that it serves, and then matters to the shipper, matters to us. Okay, good. So moving on. Matters to customers, matters to consumers, right? So, but what can companies do to prepare for the future challenges? How can they educate themselves about opportunities in achieving ambitious emission reduction targets within their supply chain? So what can they do to kind of stay in the loop and learn more?
Yeah, so first things first, C-suite needs to get involved because our transportation managers that we work with, they're not going to be really driven to make much change when it comes to alternative fuels.
Right.
But unless it's their passion project, but it really is going to come from the C-suite.
Right.
And bringing that down. And then from within that space, collaboration.
Right.
So shippers, partners like carriers, energy providers, anyone along that supply chain that you see in that scope 3, get together, figure out what we can do differently.
Right.
And then there are resources like conferences, like the ACT Clean and Transportation conference that Ben Schill, our CEO, he's speaking at later in May. Those are really great platforms to be able to network and have those discussions. What are you doing? Maybe it's something that we can apply here. Oh, you found out that this is not a good source if you have a very heavy payload. You know, what are the different things that we can do? So that's ultimately what's going to make a big change. But shippers really need to start demanding of their carriers,
right,
to have these alternate fuels, or to show what their emissions are based off of those particular fuels. We can provide calculations for it very easily, but there needs to be that demand, and then you'll certainly start to see adoption spike up if you're not going to do business with somebody.
Yep. Yeah, I think sharing stories, right, sharing experiences is so important. I mean, for us, having 10 plus years in alternative fuels, right? We've learned a lot, right? We have a lot to share.
70 million natural gas miles.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but alongside of that, some of the newer things, the limitations that have come to the surface with EV, and where it has failed, and then it's where it's worked. I think sharing those stories is important in networking, and building that network around this topic is so important. So again, that was the ACT conference, Kate?
Yeah, it's the ACT conference, the Advanced Clean Transportation Shipper Carrier Connect conference.
Awesome.
I believe it's around May 20th or so. Don't quote me on that.
All right.
Google it.
All right.
But I do think that the thing that a lot of people are waiting for these new technologies to come online.
Right.
And we need to adopt it now so we can get closer to that, so we can start making those changes on those emissions now.
Okay. Awesome. Great. So that was scope 3, a little bit of alternative fuel talk. Fantastic. Want to move on to another topic that's going to have an impact, or is having an impact, and may have some more impact in the fall months here, Christina, based on some of our conversation. And that's the current union negotiations and the rails and kind of that topic itself. So Christina, can you elaborate on kind of where things are at, what discussions are being had now, and then maybe what's coming in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, right now, for the Canadian rails, both the CPKC and the CN are in negotiations. That has now gone to a point where the different unions are voting internally on if they do or don't strike. Those has started back on April 8th. And those will be confirmed May 1st. Okay. And at that point in time, if they do vote to go on strike, there's a 21-day cooling period that is effective in the U.S., that's effective in Canada as well. And at that point in time, it really comes down to a May 22nd potential strike for the Canadian railroads.
Okay.
And what that would do is that doesn't only impact freight trains, but that also does impact major metropolitan areas with their commuter trains. So that will also have impacts there for individuals just trying to travel and or go to work or do those daily tasks. Yeah. So it's not just about freight, but on top of it, two of the biggest areas that they're concerned with right now on both sides of the house, one is salary. I mean, that's always the biggest negotiation point of any union negotiation, and it makes sense. That's why people work, right? So, but then the second part is the safety critical rest provisions that the unions are stating the railroads are excluding and taking out. Railroads are saying, no, that's not what's happening. Clearly not seeing. I don't have what the actual documentation is, so I can't say. But both sides are not in agreement right now on that.
Okay.
The other part of that salary, though, is that they're trying to move from a rate per mile payment to the employees to an hourly one.
Okay.
And so anytime you make that type of a pay change, regardless of what the intention is, an increase or a decrease, that is going to cause some people concerns because you cannot make something that changes like that equitable across an entire organization, especially when it's as big as the railroads are. But so there's probably some people who are going to be burdened and negatively, but there are also probably just as many that are going to be positively.
Right.
So it really comes down to that. Again, we will know May 1st. And then at that point in time, there's that 21-day cooling down period. And then the way that the union is set up, they have to give a 72-hour warning before they would actually strike to the railroads. So what that would do is allow for products that are moving on the rail to get to their destination, basically.
Okay. All right. Well, so there is a little more planning that goes alongside that. It's not an immediate, as soon as the strike happens.
I mean,
but
there's a little bit of a warning.
There's a little bit of a warning. That's good to understand further. Okay.
Yeah. But what you're also going to see then is you're going to see a lot of tightening down potentially when it comes to it, like we did see in the U.S. Back in September when there was the railroad potential strike, not strike, that just continued on. Here, and you saw some movement away from railroads and a little bit more push into the OTR space. So that'll also be taking place in Canada, most likely.
Yep.
The other strike that is also actively being talked about right now is along the ports. So it's all of the East Coast. So it's the International Longshoreman Association.
Okay.
And that is a potential strike that could take place at the end of September. Now, the last time that side of the country went on strike was in 1977. And that strike took place, I think, 44 days. So it was a pretty long period of time. But in that time period, the ILA has been a little bit more copacetic, I guess, when it comes to union negotiations with those import carriers than their counterparts potentially on the West Coast. So the West Coast is what everybody remembers when there was like, oh my goodness, the Port of Long Beach, especially when you saw all the containers that were sitting out there in the ocean and potential strikes there. But realistically, the ILA traditionally has been pretty good about it. There was a really good article in the JOC, even just today, this morning, kind of talking about how people are on both sides of the fence on it's going to be a non-event or it could be a potentially huge event.
Right.
I'm in a little bit more of the space of I think it's going to get buttoned up before it takes place just because of the presidential election. No party, regardless of who they are, is going to want to see that take place as an incumbent party before the election because there would be some pretty big implications to imports at that point in time. But on the other hand, crazier things have happened, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, they're looking right now to try and get, I've seen reports of up to a 40% wage increase over the next 6 years. Now, their counterparts on the West Coast did get a 32% that was retroacted back a couple of years. But we're in a little bit of a different economy than what we were 2 years ago, too.
Right.
Especially when it comes to transportation. So,
yes, 100%.
So it'll be one to kind of keep an eye on a little bit.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
So as far as with the unions and all that, what with the truckload being where it is or capacity is just ginormous. Like, what kind of effect does that have on these union negotiations?
Well, so I actually am wondering where the impact of what happened in Baltimore is really going to take place. Like, are there going to be additional things now that they want to call it for safety protocols or for workman's comp insurances and things like that? I haven't seen anything come through on that, so I don't know if there's going to be additional ads into there or not. But realistically, where truckload capacity is at, I think, and probably for a completely different discussion of where we see truckload capacity going to in the future, but we're starting to see some very small carriers come out of the market. Insurance renewals are getting really expensive. They're choosing not to do that. We have seen a couple of the carriers in our network exit for that specific reason. But I think it's going to be a trickle effect for the next couple of months. And then I think we're going to see a big drop in truckload carrier capacity. And I mean, you've got your very, very large macro trucking companies that we were even just talking about are really 1%. Only like 1% of the entire trucking population. So for a macro trucking company to go out and say, we have high insurance costs or whatever, they're going to be able to cover that, but that's realistically only 1% of the trucking population.
Right.
And so your mom and pops, your single owner operator, your trucking companies that are operating at 10 trucks or less, when those go out of the market and they start to come out, there will be a much larger impact. And especially when it comes to ports, because a lot of those draymen, that's what they do. That is just the in and out. So if you have an impacted strike for the ports that extends for a really long period of time, those draymen are going to get hit really heavily very quickly.
Right. Okay. So overall, though, the capacity with rails, or I should say demand, right? Do you think demand has any effect on maybe the negotiation power that one side or the other has at this point?
Yeah,
Because obviously demand right now,
right?
is
Yeah.
depressed.
So when I think about the CP and the CN, the CPKC, they just said that their year-over-year earnings for Q3 were down 3%, or for Q1 were down 3% year-over-year, and so they are looking at, hey, we're kind of like the trucking community has just come out and said we're doing a lot more, we're doing more volume, but we're doing it at a much lower return. And in some cases, there have been companies that have openly said we went out and bought freight, and we can't do that anymore. I think we're seeing that with some of the rails and some of the dramatic changes that they have in their transactional rates right now too. You see it with the NS right now. There's a big push on internally there on what their future looks like.
Right.
So there's definitely pressure on the rails. There's definitely pressure on the ports to make sure that they stay open and that they stay fluid. But at the same point in time, the wealth that has traditionally just been there, or people assume is just there, isn't maybe as fluid as it once was either.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, hey, great information. We could probably talk all day about this stuff, but great conversation. Really appreciate the insight. A lot of value here. So we'll close with that. Thank you so much for joining us on the What Drives You podcast. If you have a topic you'd like to see us discuss or ask some questions around, please leave it in the comments box. Thanks so much.